Hello and welcome, I'm Andy Hodges. I'm in Livingstone at the UN ECA conference that's been held here, looking primarily at the just transition to renewable energy. And I'm joined by Saul Levin, Executive Director of the Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies, which is based in South Africa. Saul, thank you for talking to me, most appreciate that. Tell me, what exactly is it TIPS, TAPS, Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies? TIPS, what exactly do you do?
So we're an economic policy research institute. We're a not-for-profit, and a lot of our work is looking at inclusive and sustainable industrial development. So we work very closely with the South African government, largely the economic departments, in trying to better understand how we can grow our economy, but in a way that includes more people, creates jobs, but is also sustainable. So we look at a lot at the just transition, at climate issues, but also very importantly at electricity and how that shapes our industrial development.
Now, one of the major issues that I know is being discussed over the next couple of days, or the couple of days here in Livingstone, is about the harmonization of policies in Southern Africa between different countries, both the harmonization, holistic approach, rather than what perceives to be or allegedly is individual countries following their own energy policies. Do you do anything looking at that sort of thing in terms of policy guidance?
So we put a very strong emphasis on regional collaboration, because South Africa, even though it's the largest economy in the region, it needs to work with its neighbours from multiple perspectives. So we've looked at, for example, what South Africa could import from the region, and also what we can be trading with the region. So there's opportunities. People are talking about the new minerals that are required for this energy transition. So there's a lot of minerals that are needed, that are in Zimbabwe. There's a lot of tin that's needed. You would have seen in Zimbabwe the dormant tin mines that were, now being resuscitated because these minerals are needed. So we need to look at how we can strengthen the trade between the countries, but also when it's coming to electricity, we've all got our different strengths, and we can see it very acutely this year, where South Africa was getting through its crisis. We're very coal dependent, overly coal dependent, whereas Zambia and Zimbabwe are very strongly reliant on hydropower, and we need to look at how we balance some of the energy requirements across the region. And at the end of the day, our strong argument is you can't grow your economies without electricity. So you need it as a core supplier for industrial development.
Reliable, consistent energy. I think that's the key. But let's go back to one of the things that I know your organization does, which is look at industrial policy, economic issues, trade issues. And of course, it's been said throughout the entire conference that without energy, you cannot grow your economy, you cannot industrialize, you cannot grow you can't even you can't get rid of poverty amongst your people. So talk to me about the link and how important it is between energy and industrial and trade policies.
So on the provision of electricity, so businesses need electricity to turn the lights on, to operate a factory. You need quite a lot of electricity. So load shedding in South Africa created an enormous amount of problems. So in the beginning, going back a decade, they would just turn it off without a moment's warning. Then business complained, and they came up with a solution of a schedule around scheduled turn-offs. So at least people could know that, there's going to be a scheduled outage or electricity rationing. People call it load shedding, I call it electricity rationing. But there's going to be a turn-off of the electricity. Yes. So there's, and some days it's more shedding than load, but that's another story. I think the issue then is we could schedule it, okay? But this still created the problem is if you can only operate your plant at less than full capacity, you can't be competitive. And so you then face all sorts of problems. There's also electricity pricing, which became an issue. The new build program that Eskom went on was very expensive. It went way over budget, and that then pushes up the cost of new electricity, which we need. So we then did an analysis. What is worse? The high cost of electricity or no electricity? Obviously, no electricity is much worse. Because it costs you a lot more. If you're turning on diesel or you have to put in your own solar system, it costs you a lot more. Then we looked at doing some analysis on, is it viable for companies to put in their own solar systems? A few years ago, the cost of solar was a lot higher. It's come down significantly, and you can now, there's new technologies where you can get it at scale. So the solution for many companies are actually going about either doing it yourself or outsourcing it to a third party.
Well, I want to talk about this because obviously looking at it from outside South Africa, it was clear that South Africa had a huge energy problem. I think Eskom was at the middle of that. Eskom was blamed a lot outside of South Africa for some of the issues there. Fast forward 2 years later, suddenly South Africa appears to be energy sufficient. They have energy to even export out. And that really does, is that about the change in both government policy, but also the realization about how important IPPs are, or what I would call, or what you would call, business to business? Talk to me about that.
So a few things were happening. So the one is definitely required policy change. So the president came in and he did it late, but he did it. And he said, okay, we're going to lift the cap on what private sector can put into the system.
Why was the cap there in the first place?
So it was to keep Eskom
in business.
Okay,
right.
Okay, but also there was a point in time when you needed utilities to provide electricity. You can't just open up a coal-fired power plant, sitting in the middle of somewhere. It's big stuff. The change in technology means you can do things in a modular way and a decentralized way. So the technology changes are very important to allowing this uptime to happen. So when you see that policy change, then it allows businesses to either, as I was saying earlier, to go through a third party to get their electricity directly from them. That means,
because now they can go off grid, if I can say that. They can deal directly with somebody else and rather not use the Eskom system, or well, at least not all of it.
Yeah, so most companies haven't gone entirely off grid. They're doing a balance. So they're using some of their own, either solar or wind, or even diesel on occasion, or they're buying from a third party, but not entirely. Some of the consumptions of just a smelter is it's staggering. I mean, it's more that you would use in one smelter than an entire, country. So if we look at, the BHP plants in KwaZulu-Natal, it's over 1,000 megawatts of consumption.
That's half of what Zimbabwe uses. In fact, we're on 1.7, so it gives you an idea.
Eswatini, one of the delegates was saying this morning, only uses 250 megawatts. So that's a smelter. That's just an ordinary smelter, that would be in operation. So we've got these big industries, and that they need alternatives. And once they start creating their own electricity or buying it, then they take the pressure off the grid. But at the same time, we do see Eskom, there's a turnaround in Eskom. They're doing more maintenance. They're using some of the parts from the decommissioned plant to fix the older plants. The new plants finally come on stream. And so all of these things, they started earlier. But then they come on stream and all turn it around.
I suppose the question is to say that it looks as if South Africa's power solution is still fossil fuel based, coal based. In other words, it doesn't look as if they are going to be transitioning to a green or renewable energy economy in the near future, because it appears that is, number one, it's the way that their system is set up, and number two, also talking about jobs only.
So to put it in numbers, South Africa used to be over 90% fossil fuel. So we do have a little bit of hydropower. We did have a little bit of solar and wind. It's now moved from over 90% to the early 80% fossil. So there's been a big change. I mean, that's, if you look at, the amount of consumption, and it's a lot of money. Particularly for a very energy consumptive economy like South Africa. So it's a lot of money and it's a lot of investment that's happened. But it's way off the mark compared to other economies. So there's a long road we need to go down in terms of balancing. And I think it comes through in the conference as well, where people are talking about the energy mix. A bit of gas, a bit of solar, a bit of wind, a bit of coal. You're still going to have to rely on coal for base load up to a point. We've got a bit of nuclear. There's talk about nuclear. It's very controversial, but they are still talking about future with some nuclear. So there is really looking at all these options in order to balance our energy mix, reduce the reliance on coal, and then ultimately we do need to move away from coal. It is causing climate change.
Yeah. Now I know that you did in the past do a research paper looking at SADC, or the Southern Africa region. Talk to me about that, because I think that it was done, in 2020 you mentioned, but it may still be relevant before COVID, but it could still be relevant now. What were your major findings? What were your major results and findings of that?
So we looked at how the South African power pool can better collaborate, because I think you made the point earlier, we seem to be going it alone, and there's a lot of room for collaboration. So how do we look? So we identified what is the main type of energy that's being used across the region. We looked at the energy deficit. There's a massive energy deficit, and that has a knock-on impact on industrial development. So particularly for smaller economies where, and I think ESCOM did the study a while ago, where there was a big push for electricity into communities that were underserved under apartheid, and then we've moved from, I think less than 40% to over 80% of communities being served in South Africa. So when they looked at it, you actually create economic activity when you provide electricity to a community. You can sell cold drinks, you can do welding, you can do all sorts of other small businesses, you can do car repairs, mechanic, all those kind of things that are not possible when you don't have energy and electricity. So how do we work across the region in terms of sharing our electricity and strengthen that Southern African power pool so that there's better collaboration? Also, because South Africa is so dependent on coal, how do you balance some of it with countries that are using hydropower? Because when we look at it in terms of the trade issues, so this is where you have to try and connect some of the dots.
Yeah, the trade, the economics and the energy.
Yeah, so if you want to trade and you want to sell products to Europe, there's a big clampdown on products that are made in a carbon intensive way. So either with the electricity use or the process, they're going to put their carbon border taxes on, and that's going to impact a lot of South Africa's exports. So what does that mean? It means that if you can find a way of balancing your electricity source, then you can reduce some of the carbon taxes that will be imposed on your company.
But isn't the conversation all about the Western world or the North, if I can call it, Northern Hemisphere, that has utilized fossil fuels? They've achieved industrial development and economic growth, and now are saying to us who are less developed and need to go economically, by the way, we won't take your products because you're using fossil fuels. You need to move to renewable. But it's back to the money now. We don't have the money to be able to we don't even have the money to try and feed ourselves and put in infrastructure like roads and bridges and so forth and railway lines, yet we still have to put billions into a green economy. How do you balance it? How do you equate the two together?
COP29 is underway at the moment. But that's where these negotiations started. So a few years ago, South Africa went, I think it was COP26, we went along and there was a lot of commitment. And we started the Just Transition Fund, and a lot of resources came in. And those resources came in to help South Africa, which is the most polluting economy in Africa. How do we move it to be less carbon intensive, but also how do we support that energy transition? So the resources are supposed to be for that. It's a whole nother discussion.
Yeah.
But the finance is being made available. The problem is that, and it's come through as well, there's the energy poverty that exists across SADC. And I think we've also spoken about it, that the money isn't there to create new enterprise and new opportunities. So that's where we need to push some of this climate finance. Say it's not only to decarbonize, we need to look at how we can use it to fund businesses that are less carbon intensive and new enterprise.
Yeah, because I was looking at the mining sector in South Africa. It's about just under 500,000 people are employed in it, and if you look at the dependents, it could go up to millions of people. And suddenly you're in a relationship where you're in a situation where you're trying to create a renewable energy area and losing jobs in your fossil fuel area. I mean, that in itself has a cost to it. You have to create new industries, you have to create new upskilling, and some people who have worked in the mines for generations suddenly have no jobs. I mean, this could become not just an economic issue, but a political one, which is even worse.
So we've looked at a lot of the issues, we're calling it the just transition. So it has to be a just transition because there's definitely a transition underway. So how do we make sure that it's just? But when you look at the whole mining sector, some of it's going to be required for this transition to new energy sources. So platinum and the platinum group metals are much needed. Chrome, which is a very big product, you make ferrochrome, stainless steel, much needed. We've got steel, the iron ore that we've got vast amounts of, it's needed. So it's really, there's a few minerals that will be negatively impacted. The big one is obviously coal. So that's roughly 80,000 jobs, maybe slightly more depending, but there's all sorts of dependencies. There's entire industries that are built off the coal sector. But then there's new things opening up. So what we're seeing is products that were not very interesting before, like tantalum or magnesium or all sorts of other things are now starting to become very interesting, and there's lots of new investment in them. But moving people from the coal area to another area, even if it's in the same province, it's disruptive. So how do you make sure that that isn't too disruptive? And we've seen it happening when South Africa was the major gold producer. We now, I think, 6th on the list or something like that. But a lot of the miners then end up in platinum. So our total mining numbers in the last 40 years have declined, but not as much as one would have expected with the decline in gold. So there's been a lot of movement into platinum. Okay, so now they move, but the platinum's in a different area. Where do the miners live? Where do they, there's no infrastructure for them. And then you have something like Marikana, which I'm sure your listeners have heard about, taking place because the miners are living in squalor and they're actually earning middle-class incomes. They should be living in decent places. They should have a nice house, they should have proper infrastructure, but they're frustrated. They're living, they call it shack farming. So what the local chiefs have done is they open up an area of land and they allow people to put their home up there, and they pay a small rental, but there's no municipal services, no one to collect the litter, there's no water, there's no electricity, there's no security, there's no street lights. So all of those, there's no schools, there's no churches. So what happens, and it's majority men, you can imagine the chaos that happens. So you can't just move, one group of people working in this area to another area without then, you need the social policies to be in place. And that's why it can't just be a transition, it has to be just. We have to look at the individuals, the people, the communities, the workers who are all impacted. They will be impacted, there will be other opportunities, but we need to make sure it's a smooth transition.
There is one concern which I know has been raised to me by experts, and that is that whatever energy policies that we're implementing appear to be leaving out the rural part of Southern Africa. So the people in the rural areas are getting further and further behind. They still have no energy, they still have no access to solar, to any other forms of energy, yet the urban areas are pulling where all the money is and infrastructure is going. So what you have is this continuous inequality between the rural Africa and the urban Africa. What are you finding in your research?
One of the things we've seen is that with the new technologies, it actually becomes possible to service those rural communities in a way that wasn't possible before. So you do need governments to make policy decisions, to make the investment, but it's affordable. At the one plant, Komati, that's been decommissioned, they've now got containers that have got solar panels on, they've got an inverter box inside, they've got some batteries that can all be controlled remotely. They're producing them there to go into rural areas, and they even got 1 or 2 export orders to other African countries. So they're looking at, okay, what do we do? They're solving one problem of, what happens to the displaced workers and what happens to the community. So they looked at opportunities. Okay, let's create these modular electricity units. It can power 20 to 30 houses. So you can then, and it's in a container, one of these shipping containers. So you can take that and you can distribute it, and it can be controlled electronically. So the technology enables you to do that so that you don't need an engineer on site, and you can service a community that would otherwise be unserviced. So the new technology does create opportunities, but you have to have a mindset change, and you have to have a willingness on the part of the decision makers to say, we're going to invest in that rather than trying to build a new power station, which is going to be, at this stage, unaffordable.
I mean, we've heard speaker after speaker at the conference talk about the unaffordability of solar, particularly for citizens, not at higher end, but just citizens of a country, and that people can't afford it. And of course, one of the issues is the cost of the batteries, the cost of the installation, possibly the duties that are involved in various countries that make it unaffordable. I mean, is that a viable solution? What is they talking?
So if you want the best solution, it's going to be very expensive. If you want to be 100% off-grid for your house, if you turn on kettles and you use microwaves and you want to keep everything going, it's going to be very expensive. Or you can take a less sexy option, but still functional. So you can have a solution that's a lot cheaper, that keeps the lights on and, keep the TV going or the computer going if you've got a child at school who needs computer or something like that, or your work if you're working from home. So you can have an option that says, I don't need everything. I'll wait till the electricity comes back on to, cook supper, or if you've got gas, you can boil we've got one of those camping gas things that you can boil the kettle with. So you can find a lot cheaper solutions. So when looking at solutions, there are multiple ways of solving the problem. You don't need to always go for the most expensive option, but that also comes to Eskom. So one of the conversations we've had with Eskom is when they're looking at some of the renewable options and using solar, they're saying we don't always need battery. We can just use the solar because we can feed it directly into the grid. And when we've got budget, then we can look at battery, and they are looking at separate projects with the IPPs, the independent power producers, providing batteries. But you can do a lot more solar than you can battery, because battery is really expensive. So there are other options. It does mean you're centering your power during daytime, which is good for industry, not so good for households, because you get home and you want the electricity. But if you want to keep your economy going, and we heard about it today, that during this drought in Zambia, the hydropower is not working, and it happened in Brazil not so long ago as well. Hydropower is not working. You don't have electricity. So if you had a more affordable option of saying, okay, even if it's during the day, we can keep the lights on, then we can look at something, some of the other solutions at night.
Yeah, because I think in Zambia, they say it's 21 hours a day with no power, and that's how we are right now as we speak. Finally then, Dr. Saul, it's tough. It's good to know all the issues. It's good to know the challenges, if I can call them that, but there should be light at the end of the tunnel, as long as, I would assume, Southern African countries, or at least the political mass of Southern African countries, together with the private sector, which is critical in any transition, actually starts working on the same path. What would you say as your wrap up to be, say, 3 of the top issues you think that Southern African countries should look at in trying to make it new, affordable, renewable energy, this just transition? What really should they be looking at?
So if we're looking at across Southern Africa, so not just South Africa, I would say the top issues are, one is very importantly addressing the energy poverty, or the people who don't have electricity, in an affordable way. That may not be it may not be the most expensive option, but it can provide a lot of relief to households that don't have anything. So I think there's very affordable options that countries can embark on that can create a lot of benefit to ordinary people. The second thing is there definitely needs to be a review of the policies, because the world has changed. You don't need the big utility anymore. You need to look at what can be done on a modular and decentralized basis, and allow the policy space to be able to encourage that, which means government is not in control entirely of the electricity system as it would have been in the past, because you needed those big systems in the past. Now you don't. So that means businesses can do it for themselves in a way that services their needs, and then governments can then come in and say, okay, we've got electricity that we can give to ordinary citizens who can't afford it through the grid. So I think there's definitely, and then the last point is what we've been talking about, is how do we collaborate better across Southern Africa around not only electricity production, but also the input materials that you need for some of these technologies. And that's another conversation, but electricity creates its own demand. We need the copper from Zambia and DRC. We need the tin from Zimbabwe. We need some of the minerals that South Africa has to go into. We've got the vanadium for some of the other battery technologies. We've got all of these minerals that the world needs, but we also need to look, it's a new value chain. We need to look at how do we get these new industries going and bring in the technology and work with other countries so that we can build an industry that also services us, but also creates export opportunities.
Dr. Saul Levin, thank you so much for speaking to me. Most appreciated.